Well then, for the second day in a row, we're doing a podcast we had not planned to do. Yesterday, it was Erik ten Hag. Today, if yesterday was news in waiting, this is a surprise. Graham Rowntree has departed Munster as head coach. There is talk of mutual agreement in the statement. Rowntree is included in the statement. That was not the case at Manchester United yesterday, where it was very clear that Erik ten Hag had been sacked. There's more of a united front here as part of the Munster statement, but who knows in the coming days what will come out about the situation. It's obviously very unusual in rugby, in Irish rugby, for a coach to go 6 games into the season. Borderline unprecedented, I think. So the statement from Munster included words from Graham Rowntree. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here in Munster, working with a very talented group of players and coaches. I would like to thank the wider Munster family for all the support they've shown me in my time here, but now is the right stage for my family and I to look forward to a new chapter. Ian Flanagan, the CEO, put his thanks on record and talked about Rowntree's 5 years total at Munster. Obviously, this would have been his third full year as head coach. And Ian Costello, who's head of rugby operations, will take on the role of interim coach. And they say in the statement, the search for a permanent replacement gets underway immediately. On his day off, Cian Tracey of the Irish Independent dragged in. Hello.
Hello, Joe. Do I still get to welcome you, or this is our first time in?
I think I'm welcoming you back, actually.
Yeah, welcoming me back.
And congratulations.
Too late to welcome you to the team.
Oh yeah, I'm beaten down and part of the furniture at this stage.
Good to have you on board.
I saw this news and I was genuinely taken aback. I mean, not that things have begun spectacularly for Munster, not that last season was amazing, but again, to that point, just we're very unpracticed to the point of it being unprecedented, where 6 games into a season, a coach and province part ways.
Yeah, you mentioned the Ten Hag example there, Joe, and it is very, I suppose, football-esque, you know, a manager parting ways with a club heading into the international break, because that's what we have now at the moment. I know Munster are playing in All Blacks 15 this weekend, but they're not back in URC action till the end of November. So, yeah, I think the news certainly came as a surprise to me. I'm sure it came to a surprise for all Munster supporters as well, who I think Graham Rowntree has really embedded himself in the club, I think in the culture, I think in Limerick City as well. It seemed to be a really good fit. So it has come out of the blue. He was contracted till 2026. It's not that long ago that he got a contract extension. So clearly Munster, the powers that be at Munster, were happy with the direction of travel. Sure, it's been a poor start to the season, and I actually think the poor start to the season has been a bit of a carryover from a poor end to the last season as well, which I don't know if enough focus has been put on that. If you think back to the URC run-in, when they were poor enough in beating a poor Ospreys side in the quarter-final at Thomond Park, they lost at home to Glasgow in the semi-final, and that obviously cost them a home final as well, with Leinster out of the equation as it turned out. So eventual champions Glasgow. Yeah, and fair decent, they were the better side on the day, but that was a big missed opportunity for Munster. So I think that form is kind of carried on to this season. They've obviously lost 4 of their 6 games. Even the 2 victories that they've had this season, Connacht probably should have beaten them in Thomond Park, and again they beat the Ospreys comfortably in Cork a few weeks ago, but that Ospreys side is missing a lot of players. Can
I just pick at the bones of that then for a second? So look, the word here is mutual consent. So they're not telling us what's happened. We do, there's no such thing as a mutual breaking up. Somebody initiates it, somebody feels it's more the right thing to do than the other, but mutual consent is what we have here, and people will draw their own conclusions. So year one, the year they win the URC title, their first trophy in 12 years, and Rowntree is promoted from within the ranks, and Prendergast comes in and Dennis Leamy comes in, attack coach, defence coach, respectively. And there's a terrible start to the season, really difficult bedding in process, and it culminates in total glory at the end of the year. They win the URC. They're so desperate 3/4 of the way through the season that they just start playing their frontliners again and again and again, and this kind of magic momentum builds, and it's a stunning first season. And then year 2, I take your point about the average ending. I characterise year 2 as an injury-ravaged one. And so many games where they were in good positions, like Exeter away, for instance, and then the bench lets them down. And they did a few good wins. Away in Toulon, I suppose, jumps to mind in particular. But yes, the loss at home to Glasgow for sure, very, very disappointing. And then the Northampton defeat in the Champions Cup, that was a really kind of a stark margin. Northampton, as the game went on, just ran away from Munster. Again, I think injuries and bench not being strong enough, part of it. But so, like, you kind of thought, being generous, season 2, tricky, injury ravaged, difficult second album. Has year 3 been that bad in the 6 games? Like, you would have to say Leinster, very explainable win, no shame. Stormers, 34-19, Sharks, 41-24. Again, very defendable defeats, albeit you'd say, look, no losing bonus point is not ideal. The Zebra one is the killer for sure. And that was the one Donnacha O'Callaghan called embarrassing, and Dennis Leamy accepted that characterisation. And maybe that was worrying because the application on show spoke of issues. But I suppose I'm laying all this out to say, in total, that's why today is a shock. Like, it's not the backside has fallen out of this thing.
No, like, there's so many points there that you've made, so I'm trying to think of where's best to start with this. So I guess the fact that we are still talking about Munster's lengthy injury list, why is that? It was an issue last season, it's been an issue this season. And while I totally take that lots of injuries, particularly in a traditional sport like rugby, are going to be accidental, you can't do anything about that, muscle injuries and things like that. But one thing that you have heard, or certainly that I've heard over a long period of time under Graham Rowntree's tenure, is that the training that Munster do is extremely tough. And I'll explain what I mean by tough. When Mike Prendergast came in as attack coach, a brilliant coup, and I think you've seen the transformation, I think is the only word you could use in terms of how Munster are playing. Graham Rowntree deserves huge credit for giving someone like Prendergast the scope to overhaul the game plan, because I mean, there's plenty of head coaches, you look at like Eddie Jones, Steve Borthwick, who want to be controlling everything. So he deserves enormous credit for delivering their first trophy in 12 years. So a part of that game plan that Munster want to play is that they train really fast. But I also, you hear, and I have heard for quite a while, is that they're pushed to the absolute limit in training, like to the point of being flogged. And I know, like, that's part of the, professional rugby and that, but I don't know. Like, Rowntree came out a few weeks ago and said that they've done an investigation into the amount of injuries, but I don't know if that's a contributing factor. And there's other certain things you hear. Like, Graham Rowntree is very old school in his approach.
Which initially was celebrated as why Munster gets Rowntree and Rowntree gets Munster.
But I think you kind of need a few soft skills in this day and age as well. And while I think the players have to take huge responsibility for their poor run of form this season, it's not Graham Rowntree's fault that players are butchering 2-on-1s by not giving simple passes, things like that. But
so are you alluding there to, for instance, I suspect half the country has heard the rumours that the conversations with Peter O'Mahony around his contract were difficult, to use the euphemism. And so maybe that is emblematic of his general manner?
That would be my impression. Now, Graham Rowntree is not here to defend himself, and he has come out in the last few weeks and said that there was no fallout with Peter O'Mahony. I suppose my counterpoint to that would be there's no smoke without fire. When Peter O'Mahony gave up the Munster captaincy, a Munster legend, like, something didn't add up. It was mid-season as well. A big surprise at the time. It took Rowntree a long time to appoint Tadhg as a successor, which I don't know, did that wound people up the wrong way. I think it was quite clear from a long way out that Tadhg looked to be the best man for the job, but he took so long to appoint him. And that's certainly something that you would hear, that maybe that old school approach around contract negotiations, dealing with players. And I wonder if guys like Peter O'Mahony, and you remember, you have to acknowledge how respected that he is in the dressing room. If your captain feels like he's being mistreated, I think that could filter through to the players. And again, as much as they have to take responsibility, the players do have the power in a dressing room. And I wonder, with all the talk of, Andy Farrell's soft skills, when these players go up to Ireland camp, we all know, like, it's almost become a cliche that they're skipping in the door down to Carton House now. They can't wait to get in. Obviously, they've gone into camp yesterday. And I wonder when they come back to Munster camp in that kind of more old school gruff approach, if it's kind of worn thin. Now, this is only my reading of the situation. This is the joys of recording a podcast, I suppose, Joe, soon after the news, because obviously everyone's trying to, do a bit of digging and find out. But that would be my reading, potentially why this hasn't worked out, that, old school nature and the training methods, pushing players to the absolute limit, and then not having enough in the tank when it comes to the weekend and the matches. And
it's interesting you say that, because actually I'm sure you won't mind me saying it's Rory O'Connor's information. He's at the cutting edge, but we were talking the other week And he was just mentioning it's his understanding that now in the post-Lancaster era that training has gone down a few notches. And these things are cyclical. I mean, someone's going to come in after Nienaber and say we need to ramp up the training again. But I think under Nienaber, there's more of a focus on being fresh for the weekend as opposed to training to the nth degree.
And this comes down to the S&C side of Munster as well that they're going to have to look at. But also it's like it comes from the top down, you know. Who is calling the shots here at Munster? It's my understanding that their CEO was very close to landing the new FAI CEO job. Whether that's true or not, he might say that it's not true, but certainly from my information that he was down to the last couple to get that job, which was obviously appointed a couple of weeks ago. It's not a great look if your CEO maybe is trying, and I accept that the FAI is a huge job in itself, but not a great look if your CEO is kind of potentially looking at other jobs as well. So I think the issues at play at Munster probably extend far beyond the head coach. And again, to give Graham Rowntree his dues, maybe he felt like that he had reached the end point, but I'd be very surprised. I thought his interview after the Stormers game on TV was pretty revealing. He's normally pretty calm, but he was totally flustered after that Stormers game. And I wonder, did something kind of click there? Even though I was on the press conference call with him last week and he seemed to be in good form. And you remember that they're only just back from South Africa. So I'd imagine that they've no sooner had they touched down in Ireland and he's given this news. So it is very unusual, but the fact that they have come to this decision and it is such a surprise makes me think that something has been going on behind the scenes maybe for longer than we think.
There was an email in actually hot off the presses from Shane, who's a Munster fan. He said, I've just read the news in Rowntree and I feel this is an awful decision from the Munster higher-ups. And again, we're at pains to point out this has been presented as a mutual parting of the ways, but obviously people are speculating that it came more from Munster than Rowntree. It doesn't strike you as a quitter, no. Rowntree. Now, he does mention his family in the statement. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but that was noteworthy perhaps. Shane continues, unless it comes out that Rowntree wanted to step down or something happened behind the scenes, fair enough. The man took over a team that was going nowhere. He got them playing an enjoyable brand of rugby and more importantly, he made them increasingly more competitive. URC title, top of the table finish last year. That's the other thing about last year. They did finish top of the table before succumbing to Glasgow in the knockout stages. Albeit, concedes Shane, poor European performances. But this is a huge progression to make over 3 years. The repeated injuries each year and therefore slow start is the only logical rationale I can think of for the decision. Maybe Rowntree refused to adapt S&C. Why he would refuse best practice, I find hard to believe, personally, but the mail goes on to say, the Zebra loss was unacceptable, but the losses to Leinster, Stormers, Sharks, all very explainable. However, when you look at all the key players that Munster have lost, not just this summer, but since he took over, Ben Healy, Feketawa, Sneeman, Frisch, Zebo, etc., Joey Carberry, and the lack of players coming through, I struggle to see how Munster will compete long-term at the top level. My overriding fear is that this is going to get worse before it gets better, and that patience to allow a new breed of Munster players come through in the system was what was needed, not a reactionary decision to a string of bad results. Rowntree, for me, is a victim of a lack of resources in Munster, and he performed as well as he could with what he had. Sorry for the essay. All the best, Shane. Do you suspect that'll be a popular opinion amongst Munster fans?
I was just going to say that email is excellent, actually. I would imagine that would be the voice of plenty of match-going Munster supporters. Like I said, Rowntree has really embedded himself in the culture, and it is important to, give him his dues for leading the club to their first trophy in 12 years. I was actually talking to someone after the Sharks game at the weekend, without knowing, obviously, that this news was coming, a supporter, and they were making the point that they would sooner still be watching Munster play this side of rugby and lose to the Sharks like they did, rather than go back to the box kick heavy approach
so
that they have.
There was no detectable unhappiness at Thomond Park.
Graham Rowntree was at the press conference last week, just the usual run of the mill, and seemed for all the world to be...
in the stands, I mean, though. Oh,
in the stands? No, I don't think so at all. I think, what was it, Shane was the email? I think he's right. I think Munster supporters are very realistic about where they stand, as much as it pains them to see Leinster pulling off in the other direction, you know, and signing Snyman.
Or Snyman's Leinster.
Exactly.
Like that's where Rowntree can say, come on.
That's where Munster are at. You know, they're dealing with the debt. They don't have the budget that Leinster do. I think, to be fair and to give them enormous credit, and Ian Costello is obviously taken on, you mentioned, Joe, as interim head coach. He's an ideal man, I think, to come in and do the transition until the new head coach. But he was a really key appointment as well, because I think he got a lot of the AIL clubs, which is such an important part of Munster rugby, and I think his role behind the scenes can't be underestimated as well. So they are starting to put things in place. You see the calibre of players. They have started producing more players in the last few years. They're doing a far better job of getting out and around the province. You know, look at the players breaking through from West Cork, from Waterford, your Tom Ahern's, and things like that. So they are conscious that they need to tap into more of the province. But that's obviously a wider issue and not Graham Rowntree's job. But if you're going to South Africa to play the Sharks at the weekend with basically a Springboks pack, and you've got two academy props, vastly inexperienced academy props, on the bench, you are fighting an uphill battle. And even you saw it when Ronan Fox came off the bench at the weekend, Joe, and he was absolutely pulverised in a scrum. Like, no one wants to see that for a young tight head. So like, Rowntree was in many ways fighting with one hand behind his back. The email didn't mention there, I don't think, Keith Earls and Andrew Conway's retirements as well, like two major leaders, not to mention two outstanding wingers as well. So I think Munster supporters, to go back to the original point, Joe, are very realistic in that they're not one of the best teams in Europe. We've seen that over the last few years, and maybe that played a role in the club's thinking behind the scenes as well, that they haven't really fired a shot at all. But if you look at the Leinsters, the Toulouses, the La Rochelle, like Munster, even the staunchest Munster supporter would admit that they're quite a bit off that. So again, I think the email is right. I think there could be a bit more pain to come. But another reason why it's so surprising, Joe, is, and you mentioned Graham Rowntree's tough start when he took over from Johan van Graan in 2022. He lost 5 of his first 7 games. So he's lost 2 of the first 6 now. And back then, there's something I was writing about yesterday, the big turning point that season was Munster beating South Africa down in Porky Queeve. What's happening this week? The All Blacks 15, albeit now a very strong All Blacks 15, are coming to Thomond Park. You have all that, magic in the air, Saturday evening, under the floodlights. And I was making the point that, again, not knowing that this was going to happen, if Munster pulled off another one of their famous results this weekend, that could really invigorate them again going into the season. Because I think I'm right in saying they'd won, after that South Africa game in 2022, they won 6 of the next 8 games. So, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that was a huge night for them. So it's a big few weeks to state the obvious, Joe. Obviously, big game this weekend, but it's definitely put a dampener on what is a huge weekend for the province and a big money spinner. Yeah.
So I suspect more information will trickle out, but as we've outlined it there, given the players he's lost and given the job he's done in the round, and given the fact that they've started seasons poorly before and rebounded very nicely, and as the Connacht CEO was just pointing out recently, a slightly different case obviously in Connacht, but I mean, there's no value really in topping the league. Just get to the playoffs and then see where you are. And Munster, still to come in, games still to come in Europe, like absolutely fine in Europe. It doesn't fully make sense in an on the pitch way. Like, the evidence on the pitch is not so disastrous as to explain this. Therefore, I am speculating that something has gone on behind the scenes, that there are disagreements, there are frustrations, there's unhappiness, there's acrimony of some kind, because they stood by Johan van Graan through a lot worse. So that's why this is a surprise to me. Things were not going well. Ian Madigan on the podcast just last Thursday was saying, I'm not sure how much they're enjoying it. I'm worried over Munster. So we were voicing worries, but not a single person, for all the many, 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 many people who talk about rugby across the media, not a single person had suggested that Rowntree and Munster might be about to part ways based on what we saw on the pitch.
That's what makes me think that this must have been in the works for a while, that they've pulled the trigger so quickly, because no one had a sniff of this, even in the media. They've gotten out ahead of the story, and even if they had waited another day for tomorrow or Thursday, it could easily have leaked out. So I don't think they would have made a rash decision, both parties, again, by mutual agreement, without having given this serious consideration. I'd say the long haul flight home from South Africa must have been great crack altogether, because the writing must have been on the wall, you'd imagine. Then, so, Munster have put the right resources in place. You've mentioned not Graham Rowntree, Mike Prendergast. Like, the players absolutely love the style of rugby that they're playing under him. Dennis Leamy, similar, even though I think the defence has been pretty questionable this season. I think the forwards, I think that's maybe an area that they might have looked at. And ironically, Graham Rowntree could have been an ideal man to have gone back to his forwards coach role. Not that was ever going to happen, to take a backward step, but maybe he was better suited to, doing the nitty gritty of the forwards, because being a head coach, Joe, is, and you've talked to enough of them in your time as well, is not an easy job. And you do move away from the day-to-day coaching generally as well. And Andy Kyriakou is the one who's looking after the forwards as well. And you look at how poorly the line-out has been going for a long time now. I'd say he's probably a man feeling the heat as well. So I know we'll get on to talk about what happens next, but I think the big question, apart from the obvious, is who's going to replace Graham Rowntree, is what's the structure going to be? Because I always found it very interesting and curious that when Munster appointed Rassie Erasmus as director of rugby, that was a new departure for them. They had never had a director of rugby before, and it looked to be that this was the new direction that they were going. Yet when Erasmus left and went back to the Springboks, Munster reverted back to the head coach role. Now, that to me sent out mixed messaging as well. So I wonder, again, what are the powers that be? Are they going to look for a like replacement and try and get a new head coach? Are they actually looking for more of a Leo Cullen type figure, a Rassie Erasmus type figure, to oversee more of the whole operation? So that's going to be a big thing that they're going to have to look at.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's funny when you analyse the performances that in some ways, if attack is the most difficult thing, Mike Prendergast has really got them into very decent shape. Even against Leinster, they could have scored more than the scoreboard might have suggested. Just a touch not clinical, but like the framework is there. It's the stuff like, as you mentioned, the line-out, which was 13th of the 16 teams in the URC last year. It's the front row, which is just under-resourced and underpowered right throughout Rowntree's time and before, costs them in Europe routinely. And then this year in particular, defence. I mean, look, I'm not an expert, but even I can see there's no pillar there a lot of the time. I mean, some really poor decisions in defence. And in hindsight, some of the application against Zebre was worrying. Like, there were players borderline. I mean, you can't say not trying. I'm not saying that, but I mean, some of the efforts at tackling were kind of bizarre for professional standards. And so on the back of this news, you then look at that and think, was there something a little bit broken there? But without this news, I wouldn't be suggesting that. So
of course, but it's again, and I go back to a point I made, Joe, it's deja vu at Munster. We're talking about an injury list. We're talking about the line-out. The line-out was poor last season. Yeah. Why isn't this improving? Yeah. And that is the big thing. Even take the Zebra game. There was no pillar defence for a try there, and that is like basic 101 of defence.
Same against Connacht.
43 seconds into the match at the weekend, they make the same mistake. So that to me suggests that there's something behind the scenes. Whatever's going on at training, it's not clicking, it's not working. Because you look even at the team that played at the weekend, like, I mean, you've got Tyg Byrne, you've got Sean Klein. I mean, I know they are missing players, and the front row has long been an issue. And to be fair, there would have been a lot of talk around, Munster had been blocked by signing certain overseas signings over the years, which certainly hasn't helped them as well. And now obviously David Humphreys has brought in the rule about not signing overseas players, because Munster are potentially in the market for a medical joker at the moment, because they've such a dearth of fit loose head props after Jeremy Loughman's injury. But they did try and rectify it. They went away and they got Ollie Jaeger from the Crusaders, but he's been cursed with injury since he's come in as well. So there has been an element of unluck, I suppose, about it. But I just think it's concerning that we're talking about the same problems over and over again. We could be having this conversation, Joe, last season. Not much has changed. And while I accept that the results, and it was a pretty difficult run that they were on, the last 3 defeats were obviously in Croke Park and 2 in South Africa. But I think it was more, particularly at the weekend, the manner of the defeats. They're all conceding bonus points as well. So yeah, it still doesn't make I'm obviously trying to justify it here, like trying to make sense of the decision as we talk it out, but it still doesn't really make much sense because, again, back to the email from Shane, I think this was a longer term project, which clearly Munster had viewed it as well, because they had given Rowntree a contract extension to 26. And I suppose...
When was that given to him, do you know?
Last year, I think.
Okay.
And I suppose, Joe, like winning the URC in his first season was, like, as you mentioned, absolutely amazing. But I think in a way probably shifted the goalpost, maybe unfairly so in terms of the expectations that we have of this Munster team. And that run that they went on, the 3 knockout games in a row, was exceptional. And not to take anything away from that, but maybe, you know, people behind the scenes at Munster now expect a little bit more. But they topped the table, like you mentioned, in the URC last season. Graham Rowntree got the Coach of the Year in the URC last season. Now, I don't know, was that given out before Glasgow won the competition? But they've been pretty poor in Europe as well. And I know it's a long time since Munster have the kingpins in Europe, and it's not really, you could argue it's not their bread and butter anymore, but the club do want to be challenging.
But like that Northampton game as well. So the bench underpowered because of injuries, and also bug in the camp, players puking on the pitch. You know, I mean, like, to what extent do you hold that against him? The king is dead, so who's in? Given that we didn't know this news was coming this morning, I doubt you know who's replacing him.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned there, I think the structure is the big question. Are Munster in the market for a director of rugby? And if so, then who is going to be the head coach? But I think a lot of this will come down to budgets, Joe, because as we mentioned, Munster obviously dealing with debt. They don't have the biggest budget in the world. Also, they're going to market now mid-season. So I don't know. In my mind, they would probably be better off to try and find, like I said, Ian Costello's very experienced.
Should they try and tug at Ronan O'Gara's heartstrings?
I just can't see that happening. He's contracted till 2027. I've made sure to check this up before I came in. When is Andy Farrell's contract expiring? 2027. In my mind, Ronan O'Gara's eyes are on the Ireland gig after the Australia 2027 World Cup. Would he leave La Rochelle, huge budget, one of the best teams in Europe, one of the best teams in France, to come back to a Munster organisation which clearly needs a lot of work from the top down? No, I'm not sure.
It's a heart over head decision if he was to do it.
Absolutely.
I suspect you're right. Not a chance. Thanks very much for the call.
I wouldn't think
goes.
so.
Any other Irish coaches out there?
Well, the obvious is Felix Jones. I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Is he head coach type?
I think everything you hear about him would suggest that he is, but how he didn't leave Munster in the most rosy of circumstances as well, I don't know, and I'm purely speculating on this. I don't know what the relationship is like there, but Munster would be absolutely bonkers if they weren't picking up the phone to Felix Jones, even on an interim basis till the end of the season. My expectation is that Felix Jones is going to be going on the Lions tour, because I understand that Andy Farrell is a massive fan of Felix Jones, which could help him, sway him by getting him back into the Irish system. I don't know if he would want a head coach position this early in career. Is he more suited to international rugby? Again, I don't know, but he is out. Well, I know he's technically on gardening leave with England at the moment, but I think is it from January maybe he could be available. So Munster would surely have a look at him.
Would Paul O'Connell be tempted?
Oh, well, I was going to say, judging off, look, O'Connell, Flannery, Felix Jones, O'Gara, it's the same names who will be mentioned, but we can go through each of them. O'Connell, I would go back to your chat, Joe, that you had with him.
Don't mind that. You're not telling me anything.
But he is so suited to international rugby.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He gets the time.
He wouldn't take the Northampton job, but the Munster job.
I don't know.
Paul, would you like to be Munster head coach?
He seemed to be so bitten by club rugby in France, and I know that's very different, but a lot of these guys, everyone has an ego, obviously, but do they want to come back and not be able to bring Munster back? But on the flip side, do they see themselves as being the man to bring Munster back to the glory days? I'd be very surprised, I have to admit. I think O'Connell has a great gig with Ireland. He's very close to Andy Farrell. I think he's going to go on the Lions tour next summer as well. I don't know if that would add up for him.
I suspect you're right. So who else is out there?
Felix Jones is the one I said who jumps out to me. Jerry Flannery, I think, is head coach material as well, but he's obviously got a great gig with the Springboks now.
Is there some Australian out there we don't know about who's going to come in?
Johan van Gran came out of absolutely nowhere. Well, sorry, I know where he came out of. He came out of Rassie Erasmus's recommendation as he was parting ways with Munster a few years ago. So there could be an overseas, a New Zealand and Australian coach available. But any coach worth their salt is in a job at the moment. So this is what I mean by maybe Munster would be better off not writing off this season, but somehow trying to get to the end of the season. I think Ian Costello could do a great job.
As in just get into the knockouts.
Just get to the end of the season and then try and get a proper big head coach in, rather than trying to get someone now for the sake of it and not being the right man for the job, because they've cycled through too many coaches over the last few years, to try and...
It's true. In quite a few of the players' books, Keith Earls, others, they're like, oh, another coach? Like, there was a real frustration within the playing fraternity at how often they were going through coaches.
Yeah, and is it the most attractive job at the moment? Like, Munster as a province and an organisation will always have the allure that they do, but they're a long way back, like I said. So I think if you're coming into a job like this, you'd want to be getting a few guarantees around budgets, about being able to bring in players, but also, like, go back to the email again, this is going to be a project, because I think Munster, even this could be Peter O'Mahony's last season. You've seen how reliant they've been on him over the last couple of seasons. So there are a lot of things at play here that I don't know would a coach certainly be leaving his job. And if he did, Munster, the RFU would have to pay compensation to get him out of job. And that's another thing about this. You'd imagine, because Graham Rowntree is contracted, there's going to be some sort of package involved as well. And finances are tight, as we've mentioned a couple of times.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming in on your day off. Now get back to work. You got to go write pieces as well. Cian Tracey of the Irish Independent, you'll see Cian's pieces. I'm sure you'll be picking up the phone across the afternoon and bringing us more details in the paper. But for the time being, thank you very much.